On the day of her wedding, Grace's faithful German shepherd, Hugo, stood in her way as she tried to walk down the aisle. The guests immediately fell into silence. For more than 10 years, Hugo had been her constant companion. At first, she assumed he was simply anxious, but what she soon uncovered would change her understanding of love forever. Grace stopped in her tracks, her dress flowing around her as Hugo leaned against her legs. He did not bark or growl. He only stared at her with such intensity that it sent a shiver down her spine. "Hugo, come on, buddy," she whispered, trying to move him. He would not budge. The murmurs grew. Her father reached for the leash. "Grace, we need to get moving," he urged. Hugo let out a low growl, making even her father hesitate. Grace's heart sank. Hugo never growled. She knelt, her dress pooling around her, and cupped his face. "What is wrong, boy?" she murmured, stroking his graying muzzle. Then she saw it, the labored breathing, the trembling legs. Her breath hitched. Something was terribly wrong. "Grace," her mother called out, her voice edged with impatience. "We are running out of time. What is going on?" But Grace paid no attention to anything except Hugo, the one who had been by her side through every sorrow and victory. She leaned in, pressing her forehead gently against his. "I am here, Hugo," she whispered. "I am not leaving you." As she helped him sit, his body leaned heavily against her. The guests whispered in confusion, but Grace heard none of it. Hugo's amber eyes pleaded with her, as if trying to say something words could not express. "Hugo," she whispered again, her voice breaking. Her fiancé, Lucas Bennett, stepped forward, concern on his face. "Grace, is everything okay?" he called softly. She looked up at him, then back at Hugo, the knot of unease tightening in her chest. Grace's father crouched beside her. "Grace, we cannot wait much longer. The ceremony needs to begin." She barely registered the words, her mind drifting into memories. Hugo, as a scruffy puppy, trembling during a thunderstorm. Hugo standing watch during her worst heartbreaks. Hugo sprinting through the park the day she met Lucas. He had always been her anchor, and now something was terribly wrong. Without hesitation, she decided. She turned to her father, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "I am not going." A ripple of shock spread through the gathered guests. Lucas took a step closer, confusion written all over his face. "Grace, what are you saying?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with an emotion too deep for words. "Something is wrong with Hugo. I am taking him to the vet." A stunned silence followed. Her mother gasped, "Grace, this is your wedding day." But Grace was already rising to her feet, slipping off her veil, her decision made. "And he has been by my side for 10 years. I will not abandon him now." Tears burned her eyes as she stroked Hugo's fur. His breathing was growing more uneven, his body trembling against her. He had been trying to tell her. He had been trying to hold on. For her. Lucas hesitated, then stepped forward, his voice softer now. "Let me come with you." She met his gaze, searching for hesitation or frustration, but there was none, only understanding. "Are you sure?" she whispered. He nodded. "You love him, and I love you." A sob broke free from her throat. Then, without another word, she gathered Hugo into her arms as best as she could, and together she and Lucas rushed down the aisle, not toward a wedding, but toward the only vow that truly mattered in that moment: to love, to cherish, to be there until the very end. Peterson shook his head gently. "Right now, he is holding on because of you, but without intervention, it will become harder for him." Grace swallowed the lump in her throat, her free hand stroking Hugo's fur with aching tenderness. Lucas squeezed her fingers. "What are our options?" Dr. Peterson sighed. "We can start him on medication today, manage his symptoms, give him more time, but eventually you will have to make a decision." The words hung in the air, suffocating. Grace looked down at Hugo, his tired amber eyes locked onto hers. 13 years, a lifetime of loyalty, of unwavering love. "I do not want him to suffer," she whispered. "Doctor." Peterson nodded. "For tonight, take him home. Let him rest, let him be surrounded by love, and when the time comes, you will know." The ride back was silent except for the rhythmic sound of Hugo's breathing, each breath a reminder of the time slipping away. Grace sat in the back seat again, Hugo's head in her lap, her dress no longer pristine, her heart heavier than it had ever been. As they pulled into the driveway, Lucas turned in his seat. "Do you want me to stay?" She met his gaze, searching for hesitation, for impatience. There was none. Only warmth, only love. "Yes," she whispered. Grace ran her fingers through Hugo's fur, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. The weight of the day pressed against her, but there was no regret. Only love, only gratitude. Lucas leaned against the couch, his free hand resting on Hugo's back. "I think he knew," he murmured, his voice gentle. "He wanted to be part of this, no matter what." Grace nodded, fresh tears pooling in her eyes. "He has always been part of my life. I could not imagine this moment without him." Hugo let out a soft sigh, his tail giving a tired but content wag. Grace smiled through her tears, leaning down to press a kiss to his head. "You are my best boy, Hugo. Always." The city outside buzzed with life, but in their small apartment, time slowed. There was no grand celebration, no elaborate honeymoon waiting, but none of that mattered. They had each other. And as Grace sat there, still in her wedding dress, with her husband's hand in hers and Hugo nestled between them, she knew with unwavering certainty, this was love in its purest form. Lucas glanced over her shoulder, his eyes softening at the sight of the photograph. He wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin against her shoulder. "I think he always knew," he murmured. "From the moment he stopped you at the aisle, from every day before that. He knew he was loved." Grace traced Hugo's familiar shape in the picture, her fingers lingering on the space where he had once been. "I just hope he knew how much," she whispered. Lucas pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. "He did," he assured her, "and he always will." The ache in her heart would never fully fade, but neither would the love. And as she leaned into Lucas, letting the quiet weight of grief settle beside the warmth of remembrance, she realized something. Hugo was not really gone, not in the ways that mattered. He lived in every moment of love they shared, in every lesson he had taught them, and in every step they took forward, together. She asked softly, running her fingers over the image. Lucas looked at the picture, then at her, and nodded. "He knew exactly what he was doing," he said. "He reminded us what mattered most." Months later, on a quiet, rainy afternoon, Grace and Lucas found themselves walking through the familiar halls of the shelter, the very place where Grace had once found Hugo. The scent of clean straw and gentle rain mixed in the air, and the soft sounds of dogs stirring in their kennels echoed around them. Grace's heart ached with a longing she could not quite put into words. She was not looking to replace Hugo. No dog could ever take his place, but the absence of his presence left a space in her heart that felt ready to be filled with love again. As they passed kennel after kennel, the hopeful eyes of countless dogs met theirs, each one searching for a home, a family, a second chance. And then, at the very end of the row, she saw him. A senior golden retriever lay curled on a well-worn blanket, his golden fur peppered with silver around his muzzle, his deep brown eyes calm and knowing. He lifted his head slightly, resting his paws gently on the floor, as if waiting, as if he had always known this moment would come. Their eyes met, and in that instant, Grace felt it, that same indescribable connection she had once felt all those years ago with Hugo. A silent understanding, a quiet recognition that went beyond words. "This is him," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, her eyes welling with tears. "He is the one." Lucas knelt beside her, reaching out carefully. The dog, his name was Lucky, according to the tag on his kennel, let out a slow, contented sigh as Lucas scratched gently behind his ears. His tail gave a small, lazy wag, and in that moment, there was no doubt. Lucas smiled, nodding. "Welcome to the family, buddy." That night, as rain softly tapped against the window, Lucky curled up in Hugo's old bed, sighing as if settling into something familiar, something safe. It was as though he understood the significance of the space he now occupied. Grace sat beside him, stroking his fur, her heart expanding in a way she had not thought possible. "We are going to give you the best life, Lucky," she promised, her voice full of quiet conviction. Because love like Hugo's was never meant to be kept. It was meant to be shared. Through Lucky, they found healing, laughter, purpose, and the simple joy of coming home to a wagging tail and unconditional love. Every year on their anniversary, Grace and Lucas returned to the shelter, not just to remember, but to give back. They brought donations, spent time with the older dogs often overlooked, and reminded themselves of the love that had changed their lives. It was their way of honoring Hugo's legacy. Hugo had taught them something invaluable. Love is not measured by time, but by how deeply you live it. And as Lucky slept peacefully beside them, his breathing steady and warm, they knew. Hugo's greatest gift had been this: teaching them that the heart always has room to love again.